Journalist recorded Godzilla on a remote island, but what happened next shocked everyone. Ryan Gosling was 30 years old. He lived alone in a small apartment in Chicago. His room was full of books, old newspapers, and boxes filled with files. His desk was always messy, with papers and pens spread everywhere. Brian worked as a journalist for many years. He didn't write about normal things. He didn't care about politics or celebrity news. He was only interested in hidden stories. He wanted to find the truth that others tried to hide. Since he was young, Brian had always been curious. He asked questions most people didn't. He would spend hours in the library, reading about old secrets and strange events. As he got older, this habit turned into a job. He became a reporter who hunted mysteries. He traveled to remote places and spoke to people who had strange stories to tell. He wrote about hidden bunkers, lost documents, and things the government didn't want to talk about. Most of his stories were published online, and some people thought he was crazy. But others followed his work closely. They believed in him. Brian's obsession had a reason. When he was a child, his father disappeared. One night, his father left the house and never came back. No one found out what happened. The police said it was a normal missing case, but Brian didn't believe that. He remembered how his father often talked about strange projects during the Cold War. His father had been a scientist. He worked for the government and often came home looking nervous. Brian was too young to understand it all back then. But after his father vanished, Brian started looking through old notes and papers he found in the attic. Some of the papers mentioned secret locations and strange tests. That loss stayed with him. It gave him a reason to keep searching. He believed that his father's disappearance had something to do with a secret experiment. That idea never left his mind. He didn't talk about it much, but it was the fuel behind every article he wrote. He believed that if he kept digging, he might find something that explained what really happened. Brian also didn't like lies. He hated how powerful people could hide things and walk away without questions. He wanted the world to know the truth, even if it was hard to believe. This mission guided his choices. It made him take risks. He wasn't afraid to go into dangerous places. He didn't mind being alone. His goal was always the same, to uncover what others tried to forget. Over the years, he had solved a few small mysteries. He had written about ghost towns, old spy bases, and strange signals caught on old radios. But none of those stories felt complete. He still felt like something big was waiting, something linked to the Cold War, something no one had dared to write about yet. And then, one day, he got a new lead. Brian had followed many leads before, but this one felt different. It came from a short message someone had sent him. The message spoke about a hidden place in Arizona. It said the location had been active during the Cold War. People believed it was used for dangerous tests. Some said it involved living creatures. Brian read the message over and over. Something about it felt real. He looked up the area mentioned in the message. It was far from towns and roads. A thick forest covered most of it. There were no records of buildings in that place. But Brian had learned not to trust public records. He packed his things. He brought food, water, tools, a flashlight, a small camera, and a notebook. He wore boots and dark clothes. He drove for hours, leaving the city behind. As he got closer, the roads became harder to follow. They turned into dirt paths. Some were covered with rocks and branches. He had to stop his car when the path ended. From there, he had to walk. The forest was quiet. Trees stood close together. Their branches blocked most of the sunlight. The air was heavy. Brian felt like he had stepped into another world. Leaves crunched under his boots. Birds called in the distance. He kept walking. Every few minutes, he checked his compass. He had marked a direction on his map. It was based on coordinates from the message. After 2 hours, the forest grew darker. The wind died down. The silence became strange. Brian heard a branch snap somewhere behind him. He turned, but there was nothing, just trees and shadows. He moved faster. He saw old signs along the way. One was rusted and hard to read. Another had fallen and was covered in moss. He saw old tire tracks too, almost hidden under the dirt. 3 more hours passed. Brian was tired, but he didn't stop. He knew he was close. Then he saw something on the ground. A flat, metal shape. It was almost hidden under dirt and leaves. He brushed it off with his hands. It was a metal door. There was no handle, only a small edge where he could pull. He took a deep breath and opened it. A cold gust of air came from below. A dark tunnel stretched into the ground. He turned on his flashlight and stepped inside. The metal door closed behind him. The tunnel was narrow. The walls were made of concrete, but they were cracked. Water dripped from the ceiling. The air smelled like rust and mold. Brian walked slowly. His footsteps echoed in the tunnel. He kept the flashlight steady. He saw wires hanging from the walls. Some had broken. Others sparked softly. He passed old warning signs. They were written in English and Russian. Some said, "Keep out." Others warned of radiation. Brian's heart beat faster. He had never seen anything like this before. He walked for almost 2 hours. The tunnel seemed to go on forever. At one point, he saw a side door. It was locked. He moved on. Finally, the tunnel led upward. Brian climbed a short metal staircase. At the top, there was a hatch. He pushed it open and stepped out. He found himself in a large, broken room. The ceiling had holes. Sunlight came through in thin beams. Vines had grown along the walls. The floor was covered in dust and old papers. Brian looked around. It was an abandoned facility. The building was wide and tall. Most windows were broken. Broken furniture and machines lay everywhere. He moved carefully. He didn't want to step on glass or sharp metal. He searched the rooms one by one. Most of them were offices or labs. Shelves were filled with dusty jars and faded labels. Tables were covered in tools and wires. Some papers were still readable. They mentioned tests, dates, and names of people. One wall had a large map. It showed the layout of the building. One part of the map was marked with a red circle. The label under it said, "Dangerous Zone." Brian marked it in his notebook. He followed the map through the hallways. The deeper he went, the darker it got. The windows were covered in grime. Light barely reached these parts. He started seeing strange things. There were large cages in one room. The metal bars were bent. One cage had claw marks. Another had dried stains on the floor. Brian's hands trembled. He kept going. Then he saw bones scattered on the floor. Some were small, like they belonged to animals. But others were too big. They didn't look human. They didn't match any animal Brian had seen before. At the end of the hallway, there was a door made of thick metal. A sign on it said, "Authorized personnel only." Brian pushed it open. The room inside was dark and cold. Shelves lined the walls. Old videotapes filled them. Each tape had a date written on it. Brian found an old TV and a VCR in the corner. He plugged them in. The lights flickered. The screen turned on. He picked a tape at random. The date was from the 1980s. He put it in and pressed play. The screen showed static. Then an image appeared. It showed the ocean. Several marine ships were floating. Suddenly, something rose from the water. It was huge. It had rough skin, sharp claws, and a long tail. It let out a roar. The camera shook. The waves crashed against the ships. Brian watched in shock. The creature on the screen was not made up. It was real. It looked like Godzilla. The tape ended. Brian checked another one. It showed scientists talking. They looked serious. Some were pointing at maps and charts. One paper showed an island marked with a red circle. Another tape had the words "Final One" written on it. Brian played it. The scientists looked afraid. They said the creature had been trapped. They didn't know for how long. They said it must never be found again. The screen turned black. Brian sat still for a moment. He didn't move. He slowly took out his notebook. He copied the island's coordinates from the tape. His hands shook. The cold air in the room felt even colder now. He had just found something the world had forgotten. Brian returned home after finding the tapes. He could not stop thinking about what he had seen. The images of the creature stayed in his mind. He looked at the coordinates he had written down. The island was far from the mainland. It was in a part of the ocean not often visited. There were no cities or towns near it. It was just water and silence. He started doing research. He searched online for anything related to the island. He checked old maps, news reports, and government files. He found almost nothing. The island had no name on recent maps. Older maps marked it with a small dot, but no details were listed. There were no pictures, no tourist reviews, no signs of any visits. That made Brian more certain. This island had been kept secret on purpose. Brian made a list of things he would need. He packed strong clothes, canned food, bottled water, rope, tools, a compass, and extra notebooks. He also brought waterproof bags to protect his camera and tapes. He knew he could not go alone. The ocean was dangerous, and the island was unknown. He needed help. He called an old friend named Mark. Mark was a boat captain. He had spent most of his life sailing. He knew how to read stars, fix engines, and survive storms. Brian trusted him. He knew Mark would not ask too many questions. Brian didn't share too many details. He just said they needed to reach a far island. Mark didn't say yes at first. He said the ocean could be rough. He said some areas were not safe. But after a few days, he agreed to go. They met at a small port. It was quiet and far from big cities. Brian helped load the supplies onto Mark's boat. The boat was not big, but it was strong. It had space to sleep and a small kitchen. Brian paid Mark in cash. He wanted no records of the trip. They left early in the morning. The sky was clear at first. The water was calm. Brian sat on the deck and looked at the waves. He kept checking the map and compass. They followed the path marked by the coordinates. The ocean seemed endless. Hours passed, then days. On the second night, the sky turned dark. Heavy clouds formed. The wind picked up. Waves hit the boat hard. Rain poured down. The boat rocked back and forth. Mark kept control, but it was not easy. Brian held onto the side. He felt sick. The storm lasted for hours. Lightning flashed in the sky. Thunder shook the air. But the boat stayed afloat. By morning, the storm was gone. The sea became calm again. But the boat was wet and messy. Brian helped Mark clean it. Some supplies had been damaged. They used what was left. Brian kept checking their direction. They were still on track. Later that day, Brian saw something strange. A shadow in the water moved beneath the boat. It was large and slow. He leaned over the edge, trying to see more. But the water was dark. The shape vanished. Brian didn't know what it was. He didn't tell Mark. He wrote it down in his notebook. On the fourth day, the sky stayed gray. The wind was low, but the waves were strong. Brian started feeling cold. He hadn't slept well. At night, he thought he heard strange sounds. Sometimes it was like whispering, sometimes like deep groans under the sea. He looked around, but the ocean was empty. The boat moved slower as they got closer. Seaweed floated near the surface. Some of it stuck to the sides of the boat. Brian checked the map again. They were close, just a few more hours. Then they saw land. A dark shape appeared on the horizon. It was the island. It had no buildings, no smoke, no signs of people. Trees covered it from top to bottom. The beach was narrow and covered with rocks. The island looked untouched. It was silent and still, like no one had stepped on it for years. They moved toward the shore. The waves grew rougher near the beach. Brian held the side as Mark guided the boat through. The boat touched the sand. They had arrived. Brian stepped off the boat. His boots sank slightly into the wet sand. The air felt thick. There was no wind, no bird sounds, only the soft crash of waves behind them. Mark stepped off too. He tied the boat to a tree with rope. They looked at the island. It seemed peaceful, but Brian felt something heavy in his chest. He couldn't explain it. It was like the air carried a warning. He looked at the trees. They were tall and packed close. The shadows between them were dark. Nothing moved. Brian took out his notebook. He checked the coordinates again. They were right where the tapes had pointed. He pointed toward the jungle. Mark nodded. They grabbed their supplies and got ready to move in. Brian stood on the shore and looked at the trees. The island was quiet. The waves behind him were soft, but the silence ahead felt heavy. The jungle seemed untouched. The trees were thick and tall. Vines hung from the branches. The ground was covered with wet leaves and small plants. There was no path, no footprints, and no sign of human life. He took out his notebook and checked the coordinates again. The spot they needed to find was deep in the jungle. Mark adjusted his backpack and they began walking. The trees quickly closed in around them. The sky disappeared behind green leaves. The sunlight became weak. The air was warm and damp. Sweat formed on their faces after only a few minutes. They moved slowly. Every step made a soft sound on the wet ground. They used a small machete to cut through vines. Mosquitoes buzzed around them. Birds flew from tree to tree. But there was no song, no chirping. It was quiet in an unnatural way. Even the insects seemed to avoid making noise. After a while, they found something strange. A metal pole stuck out from the ground. It was rusted and bent. Nearby, there were pieces of wire hidden beneath the dirt and grass. Brian brushed away some of the soil and saw faded warning signs. The letters were almost gone, but the shape of the red triangle was still there. It was a warning sign for danger. They kept walking. The trees thinned out slightly and then they saw it. A tall fence stood in front of them. It was made of metal and stretched across the jungle. Parts of it had fallen, and some sections were covered in vines. The top had sharp edges. Old signs were still hanging on the fence. Most of them had one word in red: danger. The gate was locked with a thick chain, but the side had a gap where the metal had bent. Brian and Mark slipped through carefully. Inside the fence, the air felt colder. The trees seemed older, and the light grew darker again. The ground was harder. It looked like cement in some places, but the surface was cracked. Plants had grown through the cracks. They followed the path forward. A strange smell hung in the air. It was a mix of rust, rot, and something else. Something that reminded Brian of the old facility in Arizona. The silence followed them. Even their footsteps sounded muffled. Felt like the forest was watching. Soon they reached the edge of the trees. A large building stood ahead. It was hidden between the trees, almost blending in. The walls were gray and covered in green moss. Vines crawled up the sides. The windows were broken. The roof had holes. But the shape of the building was still strong. It was built to last. It had not fallen apart, only faded with time. Brian stepped closer. The front door was shut and covered in dirt. They circled around the side of the building and found a broken window. Brian climbed through first. The floor inside was dusty. Some tiles were cracked. Broken furniture lay scattered around. Old papers were on the ground. Some had turned yellow and soft. They walked through the first room. It was empty except for a rusted chair and a table with bolts. The walls had strange stains. One corner had claw marks. They were deep and long. Brian ran his fingers along them. The cuts had gone through the paint and into the metal beneath. Whatever made them had been strong. They moved deeper into the building. One hallway had broken lights hanging from the ceiling. Wires dangled down. Some doors were half open. Others had fallen off their hinges. Brian saw more cages in a side room. They were larger than normal cages. Most of them were empty, but one still had a piece of bone in it. The bone was long and thick. It didn't match any animal Brian could name. Another hallway led to a large room with tall walls and a raised platform. The floor had dark stains. The walls had deep scratches. Some looked like something had tried to escape. A metal door at the far end had been bent outward, not inward. Whatever had been inside had broken out. Brian took pictures. He wrote notes. Mark stayed close and watched the shadows. The deeper they went, the stranger the place felt. It was like the air was holding its breath. There were no sounds. No bugs, no wind, no echo. In one hallway, they heard a noise. It was soft, like a whisper, but it didn't come from a voice. It came from the walls. Brian pressed his ear against the metal. He thought he heard a low hum. It faded quickly. He stepped back and looked around. Nothing moved, but the feeling didn't go away. They found another room with machines. Old computers stood against the walls. The screens were broken. Wires ran along the ground. Some of the keyboards still had power. A few lights blinked. There was no power source nearby. Brian didn't understand how they worked. He wrote it down. One of the final rooms had lockers. Most were empty, but some had clothes inside. They were old lab coats, torn and stained. Brian looked at the tags. Some had names. One name matched a file he had seen in Arizona. He kept it. The feeling of connection between the two places grew stronger. As they prepared to move again, Brian noticed something near the floor. A footprint. It was large. Too large for any man. It had 3 thick toes and deep pressure marks. It was fresh. The dirt inside the print was not dry. Brian pointed it out. Mark looked nervous. They stood still for a moment. The silence returned. Then the building creaked. Not from wind, but from something else. Something heavy. Brian stared at the footprint on the floor. It was deep, fresh, and wide. Nothing else in the building showed movement, but that single print said something had walked there not long ago. Brian looked around the dark hallway again. The air was heavy. It felt like something big had passed through the space and left behind a pressure that still lingered. They moved slowly. Each step felt louder than it should have. The building creaked now and then. The walls groaned like old bones. The air was colder near the far end of the hallway. They followed it. Doors stood open on both sides. Some rooms were empty. Others held broken equipment, strange tubes, and cages that looked more like prison cells. One of the cages had deep claw marks on the metal door. The floor was covered in scratch marks. The wall beside it had dents, as if something huge had slammed into it over and over. In the next room, they found another group of machines. A set of monitors still showed blinking lights. Some of them displayed graphs, numbers, and motion sensors. One sensor was active. It showed movement, slow but steady, coming from deep below the facility. Brian looked at the screen for a long time. The signal wasn't static. Pulsed like a heartbeat. Something down there was alive. They left the room and continued forward. A long stairway led downward. The steps were metal and they made a hollow sound with each step. At the bottom, they found another hallway. This one looked newer than the rest of the facility. The walls had thick panels. The floor was smoother. The lights in this section were still working. A few flickered overhead, giving short bursts of brightness. Then they faded again. At the end of the hallway, a large metal door blocked the path. A control panel beside it had green lights flashing. The door looked strong, like it was built to keep something in. Brian saw a screen above the panel. It showed a feed from a camera. The camera looked into a huge dark room. Inside that room was something massive. It was resting on the floor. The skin looked rough like scales. Its tail stretched out across the space. It didn't move. The camera feed started to shake. The screen blinked. The image turned to static, then came back. The creature in the room moved slightly. Its claws twitched. The ground around it cracked. Then it moved again, this time more clearly. Its tail scraped against the floor. The sound was deep, even though they were only watching a screen. Then came the roar. It wasn't from the speaker. It came through the walls. A low rumble shook the floor. Dust fell from the ceiling. The sound rose and grew louder. It became a roar that filled every hallway in the building. The walls shook. The lights blinked rapidly. Some of them exploded. The metal door began to tremble. Something powerful was behind it. Something that had been asleep and was now waking up. Brian turned and ran. Mark followed. The hallway behind them cracked. A loud crash echoed as one of the walls gave way. A metal beam hit the floor with a heavy thud. They ran up the stairs, through the broken rooms and twisted halls. The lights continued to flicker. More roars followed them, each one stronger than the last. It sounded closer with each second. They reached the entrance and pushed through the broken window they had come in from. The sky was darker now. Clouds had moved in. The air felt different. It was hotter and heavier. Trees shook even though there was no wind. Leaves fell like rain. Birds flew away in groups. The earth under their feet vibrated. It was no longer just the sound of the creature. It was the movement. The whole island was reacting. They moved as fast as they could. The jungle slowed them down. Branches hit their faces. Vines pulled at their clothes. The sound of trees cracking behind them filled the air. Something large was moving through the forest. Trees fell in rows. The ground shook harder. Every few seconds, another roar filled the sky. When they reached the fence, Brian stopped for a second. He looked back. In the distance, between the trees, he saw it. A massive shape, a head taller than the tallest tree. Its eyes glowed. Its body moved slowly but with great weight. Its tail dragged behind, crushing everything in its path. It let out another roar. The sound made birds fall from the trees. The jungle trembled. Brian and Mark squeezed through the gap in the fence. They didn't stop. They reached the shore and the boat was still there. The water had changed. Waves were larger now. The tide had pulled back slightly, leaving rocks exposed. Mark started the engine. It coughed and then roared to life. Brian pushed the boat away from the land. As they moved into deeper water, Brian looked back. The creature stood at the edge of the trees. It watched them. It didn't chase. It just stood still, breathing heavy. His chest rose and fell like slow waves. His tail curled behind it. The island seemed small next to its size. Then it turned. The creature walked slowly back into the jungle. Trees cracked under its feet. The island grew quiet again, but the damage was clear. The fence had collapsed. Parts of the building could be seen through the broken tree line. Smoke rose from parts of the forest where the ground had split. Brian sat down on the deck. His body shook from exhaustion. His heart pounded in his chest. He knew what he had seen. He had felt the power of the creature, and it was real. The monster from the old tapes still lived. It had not been killed. It had not been forgotten. It had only been hidden. And now it was awake. Brian and Mark sailed away from the island. The ocean was rough. Waves hit the boat from both sides. Rain started to fall again. The sky turned gray. Neither of them spoke. Their minds were still on what they had seen. Their hands were shaking. They could barely believe they had survived. It took them 3 days to return to the mainland. They arrived at a small dock. Their clothes were wet and torn. Their faces looked pale and tired. They didn't rest. Brian knew they couldn't wait. They had seen something the world needed to know. Brian took his notes, photos, and video recordings. He copied everything to his laptop. Then he wrote a long report. He explained everything from the start. He gave dates, locations, and full details. He didn't leave anything out. Mark helped him confirm parts of the story. They sent the report to several news agencies. At first, nothing happened. A few reporters answered, but they didn't believe the story. They thought it was fake or a joke. Some even laughed. Brian kept trying. He sent the report to science blogs, online newspapers, and small radio shows. Then one article went viral. It was posted on a website that covered strange stories. It had pictures and a short video clip. People started to talk about it. Soon, bigger news channels picked up the story. They contacted Brian. They wanted interviews. Brian agreed. He appeared on several news shows. Mark joined him for one of them. They explained what they had found. They talked about the hidden facility, the old videotapes, the strange signs, and the creature. The public reaction was mixed. Some people believed them right away. They shared the story online and called Brian a hero. Others said it was a hoax. They said the photos were fake. They said the video had been edited. Some people asked questions. They wanted to know where the island was. Brian refused to give exact details. He said it was too dangerous. Scientists were divided. A few believed that such a creature could exist. They talked about deep-sea animals and old fossils. They said the Cold War had many hidden projects. But other scientists said the story was nonsense. They asked for proof. They wanted to see the island and the creature for themselves. News reporters visited Brian's home. They filmed his room and his notebooks. They showed his research on TV. Some of them praised him. Others said he was just trying to get attention. People on social media argued. Some believed every word. Some called him a liar. Government officials were quiet. Brian noticed that no one from any agency gave a real answer. When reporters asked them about the island, They said they didn't know anything. When asked about secret Cold War experiments, they gave short replies or said it was classified. This made people more curious. After a few days, Brian received a letter. It had no return address. Inside, there was only one sentence. It said he should stop talking. Mark received a similar letter. They didn't show the letters to the media. They only told each other. Brian kept the letter in a safe place. He didn't know who had sent it. It made him nervous, but it didn't stop him. The pressure grew. Some people followed Brian in the street. They took photos and asked questions. Some of them were reporters. Some were just curious. Others were angry. One man shouted at him in public. He said Brian was spreading fear. Another person tried to grab his bag. Brian had to be careful. He started locking his door at night and kept his laptop hidden. A group of scientists asked Brian to join a private meeting. He went. The group included marine experts, biologists, and a few historians. They listened to his story in detail. They looked at the photos. They watched the video clips. They asked about the tapes from the Arizona facility. Brian showed them everything he had. Some of them nodded. Others stayed silent. One scientist stood up and said the story needed a full investigation. A few agreed. The rest looked unsure. A week later, a news anchor reported that a special team would be sent to the island. The team would include scientists, military officers, and a few reporters. Brian was invited to go with them. Mark was also asked. They said yes. As the news spread, people waited for updates. Some were excited. Some were scared. Online groups formed to track the story. People made videos, posts, and blogs. The creature became a topic of daily talk. Cartoons and memes appeared, but under the jokes there was fear. People wanted to know if the story was true. Brian felt the weight of it all. He didn't expect this kind of attention. He had spent years working quietly. Now the world was watching him. He was glad the truth was getting out, but he also felt nervous. Not everyone wanted the truth to be known. He felt it in the way people looked at him. He saw it in the emails he received. Some people asked for more proof. Others told him to stay silent. A few sent threats. The night before they were set to leave, Brian stayed up late. He looked at the tapes again. He read his notes from the island. He checked the photos. Everything was real. He knew what he had seen. He knew what they had run from. He had no doubt. Still, something bothered him. He couldn't explain it, but something felt wrong. It wasn't just the letters. It was the silence from people in power. It was the slow, quiet push to make him stop. He had told the world, but he felt like someone else was watching. Someone who wanted the story to fade. Brian didn't plan to stop. The world had heard the truth. Now it was time to prove it. The ship left the port early in the morning. It was large and carried many people. On board were scientists, military officers, camera crews, and journalists. Brian stood near the front of the ship. Mark stayed close. The sea was calm, but the mood was quiet. Everyone was waiting. Some were excited. Others were serious. Brian kept looking at the map. He knew the path by heart. He had followed it before. The island was not far. The journey took 2 days. On the third morning, the island appeared on the horizon. It looked the same from a distance. Green trees covered the land. The sky above it was cloudy. The waves hit the rocks just as before. Brian felt a strange mix of emotions. He was ready, but he was also nervous. Something didn't feel right. The ship dropped anchor, and small boats took them to the shore. Brian stepped onto the sand. He looked around. The trees stood still. The jungle was quiet. He turned to Mark. Mark looked confused too. Something was missing. The old fence they had seen before was gone. There was no sign of warning signs. No wires. No broken poles. Only trees and bushes. They walked forward. Brian checked the coordinates. They were in the right place. But there was nothing there. Just green plants and soft soil. The trees looked untouched. The ground had no signs of cracks. No claw marks. No broken branches. Brian walked deeper into the jungle. He kept looking for any clue, but everything was clean. They reached the area where the building had been. Brian stood still. There was nothing, not even rubble, no broken glass, no walls. The building was gone. The floor was gone. The footprints they had seen before were gone. The entire space looked like untouched forest, like the building had never existed. The scientists began scanning the ground. They used tools to check below the surface. They searched for metal, concrete, or old machines. They found nothing, just dirt and roots. Some scientists took samples. Others walked in circles trying to find patterns. One group used special radar, but the radar showed no shapes, no hidden rooms, no tunnels. The military officers stood near the edge. They kept watch. Some talked quietly. Some looked bored. The reporters whispered to each other. Some took pictures of the trees. Others looked confused. No one could explain what had happened. Brian stood alone. He looked down at the soil. He felt cold inside. He knew what he had seen. He remembered every room, every sound, every wall. He remembered the roar. He remembered the building shaking. But now there was nothing. He sat down and opened his notebook. He flipped through the pages. Everything was still there. Notes, drawings, and the map. But the world around him didn't match. He felt like he was standing in a dream, or a trick. Something had taken the truth and erased it. Mark sat beside him. He didn't speak. His face was pale. His eyes stayed on the jungle. They both felt the same weight. Something was wrong. This was not a natural change. Someone or something had done this, but they didn't know how. As the sun began to set, the team decided to leave. They had found nothing. No proof. No danger. Only stories. They packed their tools and walked back to the beach. Brian didn't speak to anyone. He stayed at the back. He kept turning to look behind him. The jungle stayed quiet. On the boat ride back to the ship, Brian stayed silent. His hands trembled slightly. He didn't feel wind or sea spray. His thoughts were heavy. He looked out at the island. It faded in the distance. It looked peaceful. But Brian didn't trust what he had seen. Back on the ship, the mood was cold. Some reporters said the story was over. Some scientists said the island had never been touched. A few believed the place had been cleaned. They said someone had come before them. Someone had removed everything. But they didn't know who or when. The military officers made short reports. They shared nothing with the rest of the team. They stayed in their own group. The journalists began writing new headlines. Most of them now doubted Brian's story. Without the facility, there was no proof. Only his word. Some reporters called it a hoax. Others said he had imagined it. Brian knew better. He had seen it with his own eyes. He had touched the claw marks. He had heard the roar. He had run through that building. But now the world was starting to forget. He felt the truth slipping away. When they returned to the mainland, Brian was asked questions again. This time the tone had changed. Reporters were more aggressive. Some smiled like they knew something. Others tried to trap him with their words. Brian gave short answers. He said he had told the truth. He didn't change his story. But inside something had changed. He felt alone again. The memory of the island was strong, but the proof was gone. Without proof, the truth had no weight. People needed to see to believe. Now there was nothing left to show them. That night, Brian sat in his apartment. He looked at the photos and notes. They were still there. The tapes were still safe. But something deeper had been taken. He felt like the story had been stolen. Not just covered, but wiped clean. He didn't know who had done it. He didn't know how they had moved so fast. He didn't know if the creature was still there or had gone somewhere else. All he knew was that the truth had been erased. The mystery was now bigger than before. Brian closed his notebook. He looked out the window. The city lights blinked in the distance. Cars passed on the street below. But his mind was far away. It was still on that island. Still in that building. Still hearing that roar. He knew he couldn't stop. Not now. He had seen too much. The truth was out there somewhere. Even if the world didn't want to believe it. Even if someone was trying to hide it. The truth was still alive. Just like the creature.